By 1700, the walled city on the Shannon had fallen twice, and the treaty that ended the fighting had been broken within a few years of the signing. What Limerick did next was to turn its back on the walls that had failed it. Over the next 2 centuries, it built itself again, a little to the south, in red brick and straight lines, and it became in turn the bacon capital of an empire, a city that governed itself for 2 weeks with its own printed money, and the place where the river of the siege was harnessed to light a nation. The images in this film are AI-assisted reconstructions of a Limerick that has largely been rebuilt or swept away. Small imperfections may appear, but they let us walk through a city that is mostly gone. It is a story of reinvention, of a bad name hard to shake, and of a slow return. And it ends at the same place the fighting did, at a rough block of stone by the water. The turn began not with a decision, but with a doorway. In 1760, workers broke a hole in the medieval wall to open a way south, out from a new square of stone houses that Edmund Sexton Peary had built at the southern edge of the old town. Over the following years, the walls came down, piece by piece, a gate here, a run of rampart there, and their stones were carried off to build something else. The city was eating itself. What rose to the south was a different Limerick entirely. On the Peary estate, across a branch of the river, a grid was laid out. Long, straight streets of red brick, 4 stories over cellars, plain and confident. It was bought in lots and built by phases, and it walked steadily southward, 1 street a decade, for 70 years. The custom house moved out to meet it, and the courts and the theatres followed. And there was an irony in who built it. The first real Georgian quarter was raised not by Peary, but by 2 Catholic merchants, men whose families had been driven out of the walled city by the penal laws, and who had taken refuge on Peary's land. The city that the treaty had punished was building the city that came next. A visitor of the time put it simply. In 40 years, Limerick had gone from a gloomy fortress to a bright and elegant town. What paid for the new streets was, more and more, the pig. Limerick had always been a provisioning port, salting meat for the navy and the plantations, but in the 19th century it turned that trade into an industry. 4 great bacon houses rose over the century. Matteson came first in 1816, then Shaw, then O'Mara, and finally Denny, a Waterford firm that opened a Limerick plant in 1872. The scale is hard to picture now. In a single week of August 1895, more than 3,000 pigs were killed in the city's factories. By 1900, Limerick was curing as much bacon as Cork and Waterford combined. O'Mara's grew so confident that in 1891 it sent its own butchers from Limerick to build a bacon factory in the Russia of the Tsars, and ran it until the Revolution of 1917 swept it away. The city made finer things too. For a few decades it was famous for lace, invented here from nothing in 1829, and employing some 1,800 women by the early 50s, until the machines of Nottingham killed it. And before the lace there were gloves. Kid gloves so fine that a pair could be folded into a walnut shell, made from the skin of stillborn calves. Queen Victoria ordered them by the dozen. But the good years were already shadowed. From the 1890s, Danish bacon was undercutting the Irish price, and that shadow would only lengthen. The bacon money was building one Limerick. In the middle of it, hunger nearly emptied another. Limerick's workhouse had opened in 1841 on the north bank of the river, built for 1,600 people and meant to serve a district of more than 130,000. When the potato failed, it drowned. By January 1849, it held 5,800 souls, more than 3 times its capacity, spilling into 4 requisitioned buildings across the city. What happened inside those walls is carried better by silence than by pictures. But the river tells another part of the story, and it is not the one you would expect. Limerick was not a port of coffin ships. In 1847, more than 9,000 people emigrated through it, and the death rate on its ships was among the lowest in Ireland, a fraction of Cork's, a fraction of Liverpool's. 50 vessels sailed from Limerick to Quebec that season, riding out on the empty holds of the timber trade, and all the while, food kept leaving. Through the worst of it, ships cleared the port loaded with butter and grain, and the very bacon the city was famous for, while people starved a mile upriver. The county did not recover for a century. 330,000 people in 1841, 262,000 10 years later. Some are buried in a pit at Killeely that the locals called the Yellow Hole. The rest are the reason there are Limerick names on 4 continents. In the spring of 1919, for 2 weeks, Limerick governed itself. It began with a death. Robert Byrne was a postal worker and a trade unionist, a prisoner on hunger strike. When the IRA tried to break him out of the workhouse hospital, he was shot, and on the 6th of April he died. But the strike that followed was not about Byrne. It was about a line the army drew on a map. Declaring the city a special military area, the British commander ruled that from the 14th of April, no one could enter or leave Limerick without a permit. A permit to walk in and out of your own city. The answer was total. Around 14,000 union workers stopped work in a city of 38,000, and the women of the Cleves factory walked out first. The strike committee took over, and for 2 weeks it ran the place. It fixed the price of bread. It opened food depots. It let the newspapers print only by its permission. And it printed its own money, notes for 1, 5 and 10 shillings, signed by the committee. Money that the shopkeepers took, and that was all quietly redeemed when it was over, with a surplus. By accident, the world was watching. A crowd of foreign journalists was already in Limerick for a transatlantic air race that never flew, and they cabled the story out. They called it a Soviet, but the guards on the depots blessed themselves at the Angelus, and no one was ever arrested. In the end, it was not the army that broke the strike, but its own side, the union leaders, and the bishop, and the merchants, and the simple fact that the money ran out. The years around the Soviet were the years of 2 wars, and Limerick's part in them was a strange one. The city itself barely fought. An IRA inspector who came through in 1921 complained that its men did not even ripple the surface of the British occupation. The real fighting was out in the county. An ambush at Dronkeen that killed 11 policemen in a single action, one of the worst losses the Crown forces suffered anywhere in the war. But the war reached into the city after dark. On one night in March 1921, under curfew, the mayor of Limerick, the man who had been mayor before him, and a volunteer were shot dead in their own homes within a few hours by men of the Crown's own police. One of the murdered mayors left a widow, Kathleen O'Callaghan, who was elected to Parliament that same year and voted against the treaty. Then the sides that had fought together turned on each other. In July 1922, the Civil War came to the streets of Limerick, 10 days of it, and it ended the way so much of that war ended, with the defenders setting fire to their own barracks and walking out into the dark. In the middle of all this, a 26-year-old Irish engineer was sitting in Berlin with an idea about a river. Thomas McLaughlin had gone to work for Siemens in 1922. Harnessing the Shannon was not a new thought. People had talked about it since the 1840s. But what McLaughlin imagined was of another scale entirely. A single power station on the great drop between Killaloe and Limerick, feeding a grid that would cover the whole country. He convinced his German employers first, then carried the plan home to a state that was 2 years old. The contract was signed in August 1925 for £5.2 million, on its own close to a fifth of everything the young state took in that year. The building of it was brutal. Around 5,000 men dug the head race. Most of them paid the agricultural wage of 32 shillings a week, working 54 hours, answering the German foreman by a number stamped on a disc hung round the neck, with no protective clothing at all. No one knows for certain how many died. The memorial on the site remembers more than 30. A search of the death records finds more than 50. When 2 men fell 12 metres onto concrete in August 1929, the inquest jury found the contractors grossly negligent, and no one was ever prosecuted. And it worked. Ardnacrusha was never the largest power station in the world, whatever the newspapers said. But for a country of that size, it was without equal. And by the middle of the 30s, it was carrying almost 90% of the national grid. The river that had decided a siege now lit the whole island. It had a price the fish paid. The great salmon runs of the Shannon collapsed. The famous falls at Dunas ran dry. And from then on, the level of the water under Limerick's own bridges was set by men at a dam upstream. The factories that had made the city could not save it. Through the 1970s and 80s, the bacon houses closed one by one, the last of them, O'Mara's, in 1986. Other work came and went with terrible speed. A great steel plant shut in 1977. The German firm Krupp's pulled out, and on a single day, in January 2009, Dell moved 1,900 jobs to Poland, the worst day the modern city had known. As the old lanes were cleared, their people were moved out to great estates on the edge of town, and something in that transplanting went wrong. At Christmas 1982, 3 unconnected killings in a few days earned Limerick a name it could not shake: Stab City. Even though the city had fewer crimes than Cork, which was smaller, the name was a caricature, and it stuck. And the people who studied hardest how a city gets a name like that were the researchers of Limerick's own university. The turn came slowly and from unlikely places. From a rugby ground where, one October afternoon in 1978, the province beat the All Blacks and never let the city forget it. From a hurling team that ended a 45-year wait and brought 90,000 people into the streets, more than the whole population of the city. From a new confidence that in 2024 made Limerick the first place in Ireland to elect its own mayor. And it came back, in the end, to a stone. In 1865, they had lifted the rough block of limestone by the river, the one the treaty is said to have been signed on, onto a pedestal to stop souvenir hunters chipping it away. Today, the great plan to rebuild the city carries its name, the Treaty Stone Partnership. 3 centuries on, a city that was broken on a promise has made that broken promise the emblem of its return. Limerick still calls itself the City of the Broken Treaty.